Hello, I'm Natasha, aka Natashka, your illustration teacher. And today I'm going to teach you exactly how you can achieve this grainy shaded effect for your illustrations inside of Adobe Illustrator. This tutorial is going to be broken into three main parts. In part one, I'm going to start off with the basics, showing you how to create different types of grainy shaded effects on a basic, simple shape. We're going to start off things nice and easy, and then in part two, things are going to get slightly more complicated when we start getting into irregular shapes. Then, once we've mastered that, in part three, I'm going to show you how to apply it to something very complex, like an illustrated character. I'll add timestamps in the descriptions if you decide you want to skip ahead, but I do recommend watching all the way through because there are certain simple tips and tricks that I give in the beginning stages that will make the advanced approaches much easier and more streamlined when you get to them. Side note, if you want a tutorial on how to create a simple character illustration like this, I have another YouTube tutorial that I will link in the description. Okay, so if you want to follow this step by step using my illustration, I've included a free download of my Adobe Illustrator file. I'll drop the link in the description below. Otherwise, you can just use your own illustrations if you like. Okay, so let's just get straight into it. So when it comes to creating a grainy shaded effect in Illustrator, first and foremost, you need to create a shaded effect first. So let me show you how to do that. So just for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to go to my shape tool and just create a simple shape. I'm just going to make sure that it has a solid fill and no stroke. Now what I want to do is duplicate this shape, and I can do that by right-clicking and selecting copy, or using the keyboard shortcut Command C, and then by navigating up to edit in the top menu and selecting paste in place, this now pastes a direct copy of that shape over the top of itself. And I'll just move that to the side so that you can see that there are in fact two copies here. Also, instead of going up and selecting paste in place, you can also use the keyboard shortcut Command F, and that will do the exact same thing. All right, now that we have a copy of our base shape, now I'm going to apply a simple gradient by selecting this button here. By default, this is going to create a solid black to white gradient, so we can go ahead and change that. If you don't see your gradient window, navigate to Window and select Gradient, and now you should see this box pop up. So by double-clicking the black color, I'm going to make this a slightly darker color than my base, but you can pick whatever color you like for this. Now, when it comes to the white, you actually want to turn the opacity down to 0 so that it is see-through. But you might notice that we're getting this sort of grayish effect in the middle of our gradient. This is because we're still fading to white. So we will also want to change the color on this side too. Usually I just make it the same color as the dark side, and you can see that that's already looking so much better. So just to make it really clear, all we've done so far is created a base shape and then created another copy directly overhead with a simple linear gradient. It's also important to note that from this point, we can select our gradient tool and play around with the direction and intensity of that gradient. Okay, now we can finally add our grainy effect to this gradient. So select the gradient shape, then navigate up to Effect, scroll down to Texture, and then select Grain. From here, you'll see this pop-up window where you can start to play around with some of the different grain parameters. For grain type, you can click around in here and test out some different options available. There are a few different options that you may want to test out depending on the kind of look that you're trying to achieve. And there are also some slightly strange types in here that I don't think I've ever used even once, but who knows, you might find a use for them. I personally like to use the soft option in my own work, and I'm going to be using it for the rest of this tutorial. You can also play around with the intensity and contrast in here. There's really no magic number that you need to hit. It all really depends on the kind of look that you're trying to achieve in your own work. I'm going to go with 26 for intensity and 53 for contrast, and then hit OK. Okay, so we're almost there. At first glance, you might look at this and think it's looking great, but if you zoom into the edge, you will notice that we have this frayed look going on. This is especially true when we're working on shapes with a curved edge, so we need to get rid of that. One way you can do this is by creating a clipping mask, but I'm going to show you a different way that I feel is much easier. So first, what I want you to do is cut the gradient layer. Now, with the base shape selected, navigate over to your toolbar and find this little draw inside icon. If you aren't seeing it, click these three dots and make sure that you're seeing all of these options at the bottom. Okay, so once you've selected draw inside, this dashed line should now appear around your shape. And now what we want to do is paste our gradient back in the same position as we had before. So navigate up to edit and select paste in place. Now we want to exit the draw inside mode. So go ahead and click draw normal. And there we go. If we zoom in, we can now see that we have a clean, crisp edge, which looks so much better. You might also notice that this acts as one shape now. If we wanted to edit our grain or gradient, we would need to double click the shape first. And now you can see that it is editable. We can move it around, tweak the gradient itself. And if we wanted to go back into the grain settings, we can go up to Window, Appearance, and in here we can select Grain, and that will open our settings back up for us. Now this next part is purely preference, so you don't need to do this at all. But when I zoom in really close on my grain effect, I see that it's made up of these rainbow colors, which isn't a huge deal, but to kind of neutralize this, I just apply a multiply blending mode, which you can do by navigating to Window and selecting Transparency. Then when this window pops up, select Multiply. Again, there isn't a huge difference here, but I personally like this look a little bit more. Now, just remember when you're done editing the gradient layer, just make sure you exit by hitting Escape. Alrighty, so that's the easiest and most simple way to apply grainy shading. This approach is really great if you want to add shading and texture to a 2D flat illustration. But let's say you want to use shading to create a little bit more of a 3D look and effect. Let's get into that. So let's copy this shape over. When it comes to creating a simple sphere effect, this is as easy as just changing the gradient type. So double click into this shape so that you can select your gradient, and then in your gradient toolbar at the top here, select the radial option. And now you can see we have this perfect little sphere. And you can also go ahead and tweak the gradient settings to play with how the light would hit the sphere. Now, this is a very useful technique to keep in mind for whenever you have a circular shape that you want to shade. But what happens if you have a more irregular shape or blob like this? So I've duplicated my shape and I've applied a radial gradient. You can immediately see that this isn't going to work for us. No matter how much we try to tweak and adjust the gradient, we just aren't going to get that convincing shaded effect applied to our shape. So this leads us to part 2. I'm going to show you how to add 3D-like shading to an irregular shape just like this. So delete that, and here is what we're going to do instead. So remember at the beginning of the video when I said, when it comes to creating a grainy shaded effect in Illustrator, first and foremost, you need to create a shaded effect first. Well, this is key because there are actually other ways to create shaded effects in Adobe Illustrator that don't involve using gradients at all. And I'm going to show you how. So once again, duplicate the blob shape, and this time on the top layer, instead of adding a gradient, just turn it into a stroke with no fill. Give it the color that you would like to use for the shading, and just up the stroke weight a little. Doesn't really matter how much at this point, we'll go in and fine tune that a bit later. Okay, so now basically you have your base shape and another stroke layer on top, which is going to be our shaded layer. So with that stroke selected, navigate to Effect, scroll down to Blur, and select Gaussian Blur. Now you will get this little pop-up box where you can now go ahead and decide on the radius of your blur. If you move the selector all the way over to the left, you'll notice that your shape appears a lot more sharp, and the more you push it to the right, the blurrier it appears. The trick is to make the blur look as though it is a clean, smooth gradient. Once you're happy with how that's looking, hit OK. Now, if you like, you can go back and play with the stroke weight again if needed. And if you need to go back in and tweak the blur radius for any reason, all you need to do is reopen your appearance panel, find the Gaussian blur effect, and click on it. Alright, so now we have this shaded effect. Now we just need to have it cropped to our base shape. And we're going to do that in the exact same way we did before. So cut this top layer, select the base shape, navigate to Draw Inside, and then paste that layer back into place. And there we have it. We have this really nice uniform shaded effect applied to our blob shape. Now, before I go ahead and add the grain effect, I want to talk a little bit more about other approaches to this technique that will help you achieve the exact look that you're going for. So I'm just going to copy this blob over, double click it so that I can edit the stroke. And just to make things a little easier to see, I'm just going to hide the Gaussian blur effect in the appearance panel for now. The effect will still be there, we're just hiding it for a moment. So now we have the option to tweak the stroke however we like. We can make certain areas of the shadow more thin, we can make them disappear altogether. And so now when you toggle that blur visibility back on, you will see that this has helped us achieve a slightly different quality to the shading. You might also choose to delete certain parts of the shading, draw new parts in, and even add in different colors if you like. And now if you turn that blur effect back on and apply it to any new strokes that you created, you can see that you now have this really interesting shading effect going on. So one watch out, if you're using strokes in this way, be sure to keep this middle line of your stroke on the outside of your base shape. And the reason for this is that if you start pulling the strokes into the shape, it may look fine when you don't have the blur effect on, but as soon as you turn that back on, you will notice that the base color starts to shine through on the other side. And maybe that's what you're going for, but in most cases, it isn't ideal. Now, one last approach that I quickly wanted to run through is using shapes instead of strokes. So while strokes are great in the cases that you might want a really regular strip of shading along the edge of your shape, using shapes can give you much more control when you want more irregular shading. And it all works the same way. But instead of strokes, I'm just using shapes to define the areas that I want to add my shading. And of course, once I'm done, adding in that blur effect. Another cool thing that you can do is using the exact same method to apply highlights. In this case, I'm going to use a light yellow color to define the highlight areas, adding my Gaussian blur, and in this case, I'm going to use the overlay blending mode so that it just blends more effectively with the shadows. So now that we have these different blobs with different kinds of shading applied to each, it's time to go through and add in our grainy effect. So to do that, we double click on the shape we want to edit and make sure that we have the stroke shape selected and not the base. And the way that you can make sure is just by looking at your fill and strokes panel here. Now navigate to Effect, Texture, Grain, and of course in here you can adjust the settings if you like, but I'm just going to hit OK. And there we have it. We have our grainy shading effect applied to this first blob. And if you like, you can change the blending mode of your grain as well. And just a reminder, you can edit this by going over to your appearance panel and changing your blur settings. You can also edit your grain settings here too. You can increase or decrease the stroke weight in your stroke panel. And if you select the direct selection tool, you can also change the actual shape of the shading itself by moving these anchor points. Okay, so let's just quickly go ahead and do the same for the other blobs, just so we can really make sure that we have a good grasp of this process. So in this second one, I have 2 lines. So I just need to make sure that I have both selected. Then I go up to Effect, Texture, Grain, and that's that. And the same goes for the last one. I'm just going to go in and select the 3 different shading shapes and the 2 highlights, going to Effect, Texture, Grain, and that's that. I know this process isn't the easiest, but once you wrap your head around it and get some practice, it will become easier, I promise. Okay, so now it's time to finally move into part 3, where we take everything we've learned and finally apply it to a character. As I mentioned before, if you want a free download of this file, I've dropped a link in the description. Okay, so let's get into it. Now, when you're adding shading to something like a character, chances are that you will want to use the irregular shape method we talked about in part 2. But if some of your shapes are really simple, like if you have a circle, you can totally use the gradient method we talked about in part 1. Okay, so let's start with a very simple shape like this one here. Nothing new here. Basically, we're going to duplicate our shape, apply a stroke to the top layer, give it a darker color, increase the stroke width a little, navigate to Effect, Blur, Gaussian Blur, tweak the radius if needed, then Effect, Texture, Grain, hit Multiply if you like, and lastly, cut that layer we just created, select the base layer, click Draw Inside, paste in place, and then make sure you click Draw Normal to exit that. So that's the main gist, nothing new here. Side note, it may be helpful to have a little swatch up to the side of the stroke we just created. This will just make it so much easier for us to quickly create the rest of our shadows, making sure we're accidentally not using the wrong shade of green or whatever color that you might choose. All right, easy enough, but where things start to get a little complicated is when we run into shapes like this. And I'm just gonna change the color for a sec, just so you can see what's going on. We have two shapes that make up the leg, and it's been drawn this way because we want the shading to be applied to the thigh and the calf individually, but we want them to connect as seamlessly as possible at the knee. So I'm just gonna make these the right color for a moment, and before I show you how to approach this the proper way, let me just quickly demonstrate the wrong way. If you were to follow the exact same process that we just did for this little piece of the jacket here, so duplicating both shapes, applying a stroke to the top layer, which, side note, I'm doing by eyedropping that little swatch that we created before. Okay, now applying blur and grain, and you can see that things just aren't looking quite right. Firstly, we don't have that seamless join at the knee, and the shadow just isn't where we want it to be on the thigh. One option is to go in and just start adjusting the stroke like so to try and get things to look right. But this is difficult and tedious, so I'm just going to show you how I would approach this instead. So starting over, I'm going to start with the thigh. I'm going to immediately jump into Draw Inside mode. And I'm going to use shapes instead of strokes to create my shaded areas. It's a little hard to see at this point, so I'm just guessing the general position. I think something like this would look pretty nice. And now I can go ahead and refine it until it's looking something like this. And before I add blur and grain, I'm going to do the same for the other part of the leg. Once again, using Draw Inside mode. Okay, now both parts of the legs are looking great. And now you could go ahead and add blur and grain at this point if you like. But let's say that you want to have shadow on this side of the leg too, right where that seam at the knee is. Here's what you can do. Without going into Draw Inside mode, create the shape of the shadow that you want. You need to make sure, however, that the shadow is connecting seamlessly to the other shadows that you've already created. Something like this. Okay, now cut that shape, and what we want to do is paste it into both of our leg shapes. So go to Draw Inside mode for one part and hit Paste in Place. Now you'll notice that you have two shapes in here. To keep things neat and simple, navigate to Pathfinder and hit the Unite option. This is especially important if you decide to add blending modes later on. Okay, and then do the same part for the other leg, also uniting both of those shapes that are connecting up top. Okay, and now you should see we have a perfect seamless shadow. Now, once you're happy with how this is looking, go ahead and add your blur and grain to all the shadow shapes you created. Make sure that you use the exact same blur radius and grain settings for all of these shapes for the meanwhile, and I'll show you why in a second. So here's that blur and grain applied to that first shape. I'm also going to apply the multiply blending mode, and now I'm doing the exact same with the other part of the leg. Not forgetting to add that blending mode too. So as you already know, you can just adjust the look of these shadows by going into the blur and grain settings. But you need to be careful with this, because if you change the settings in one of these shapes, you'll find that they won't match anymore. So all you need to do is make sure that if you change something in one shape, you also have to change it in the other shapes just so they match. Okay, so now hopefully you get the gist. This isn't the easiest process in the world, but it does get easier and quicker with practice. And this is really a great method if you want to keep your whole workflow inside of Adobe Illustrator. Okay, so one last thing that I want to do is show you how to add highlights. I already touched on this slightly before, but let me just rehash it to show you how it would work on a character like this. So let's say you want to add a highlight to this leg. Instead of using the draw inside functionalities, I would just simply draw straight over the top. So let me demonstrate how I would do that. So using a color that's a bit lighter than our base, I'm going to go in and draw a simple stroke with a round cap just like this, stretching over both of our leg shapes. Again, you can play around with that stroke width if you like. Now I'm going to apply my blur, the grain, and instead of multiply, I'm going to select lighten, but you can test out different blending modes and use whatever you like best. And that's all there is to it. So here's the version I prepared earlier with all the shading applied, and here's the version with the highlights added as well. I sincerely hope this tutorial was helpful. I know that this process can get a little finicky at times. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments. If you liked my style of teaching and want to learn more from me, be sure to subscribe, and that way you'll keep up to date with all of my free content that I try to post on YouTube as frequently as possible. And also, if you want to find out some other ways that you can learn illustration from me, check out the link in the description. Okay, until the next tutorial, bye for now.